A black businesswoman, polished and confident, steps into the airport, ready to board her first-class flight after closing a major deal. But in the span of just 10 minutes, her world is turned upside down. A pilot, blinded by prejudice, stops her in her tracks, questioning her right to be there. What followed wasn't just about a ticket, it was about dignity, justice, and a fight that would spark a ripple effect far beyond that terminal. Stay with me, because this is a story that reveals the quiet but pervasive weight of everyday racism and how one woman's resilience started a movement. Before we dive in, comment below with your thoughts. And don't forget to subscribe for more stories that uncover the truths we need to face. Ava Robinson moved through the airport terminal like a breeze before a storm measured. Poised, yet carrying an energy that lingered in her wake. Her heels struck the tiled floor with purpose. Each step a quiet declaration that she belonged, that she was in control. She was used to these spaces, the hum of flight announcements, the flow of weary travelers dragging suitcases behind them. But today, she would confront something far heavier than carry-on luggage. At gate 17, a small line of passengers had already begun to form. Ava, with her tailored navy suit and silk scarf knotted perfectly at her neck, approached the counter. The young man behind it greeted her with a distracted smile, his fingers poised over the scanner. It was a moment Ava had rehearsed countless times in her head routine. Forgettable, or at least, it should have been. "Good morning," Ava said, extending her boarding pass. The man's smile faltered, his eyes flicked from the pass to her face. And there it was, the pause. A fraction of a second too long, but loud enough to fill the space between them. Ava felt it like a pinprick, sharp but familiar. She had encountered it in department stores when clerks hesitated before greeting her, in restaurants where servers avoided eye contact, in boardrooms where colleagues stumbled over her name. It was the moment when her presence disrupted the unspoken order of things. "First class?" the man asked, his voice betraying his uncertainty. "Yes," Ava replied, her tone steady but firm. He glanced over his shoulder, searching for something or someone to affirm what he could not. Standing a few feet away, Captain Matthew Blake leaned casually against the counter, his arms crossed over his crisp uniform. He had the look of a man who thought he commanded not just the plane but the entire space around it. When their eyes met, Ava saw it, the flicker of suspicion, the unspoken question. "What are you doing here?" Blake straightened and approached the counter with deliberate slowness, the smirk tugging at the corner of his mouth betraying a confidence Ava recognized all too well. It was the confidence of a man who had never been told no. A man who had never had to explain himself. "Is there an issue?" Ava asked, her voice slicing through the tension. Blake tilted his head, the smirk growing wider. "Just making sure everything is in order," he said, his tone dripping with something that wasn't quite politeness. "You know how things are these days." Ava's fingers tightened around the strap of her handbag. She had heard this before, words that carried no weight on the surface but were loaded with meaning underneath. "You know how things are these days." It was the kind of phrase that could mean anything and nothing at all, depending on who was listening. For people like Blake, it was a shield, a way to deflect responsibility while reinforcing the very systems they claimed to be neutral. "I wasn't aware passenger checks were part of a pilot's responsibilities," Ava said, her voice calm, measured. Blake chuckled, a dry, humorless sound. "When it comes to safety, I like to take a hands-on approach. Protocol, you understand." The gate agent shifted uncomfortably, his eyes darting between them. A murmur rippled through the growing crowd of passengers, some of whom had begun to notice the exchange. Ava felt their stares like a weight pressing against her back. Some were curious, others indifferent, but most were silent. It was the kind of silence Ava had grown accustomed to, complicit, convenient, and deafening. "If there's a problem with my ticket," Ava said, raising her chin, "I'd like to know what it is." Blake's smile faltered, but he recovered quickly. "No problem," he said smoothly, "just taking precautions. You understand." Ava didn't blink. "No, Captain, I don't understand." For a moment, the air between them seemed to freeze. The murmurs grew louder, and Ava could feel the tension building, thick and oppressive. She knew what was happening. Blake wanted her to shrink, to step aside, to disappear. He wanted her to confirm his assumptions that she didn't belong here, that she was out of place. But Ava Robinson had spent a lifetime navigating spaces like this. spaces that were never designed with her in mind. She was tired of shrinking. Without breaking eye contact, Ava reached into her bag and pulled out her phone. The action was deliberate, a silent declaration that she would not be dismissed. "I'll be calling my husband," she said simply, her voice carrying over the murmurs. "He'll want to know why I'm being delayed." Blake's smirk returned, but it was smaller now. "Tighter, by all means," he said, stepping back as if to give her space. But his voice, low and mocking, carried just far enough. "No phone call is going to change the rules." Ava dialed the number, the sound of the ringing line cutting through the noise. When her husband's voice answered, calm and steady as always, she felt the smallest measure of relief. "David," she said, her voice clear, "I need you at gate 17. Now." Blake's smirk vanished. The gate agent stood frozen, his hand still hovering over the scanner. And Ava? She stood tall, her dark eyes unwavering, as the weight of the moment settled around her. The crowd fell silent, waiting for whatever would come next. In the distance, Ava could see David approaching, his stride purposeful and unhurried. As he moved closer, the air seemed to shift. And for the first time, Captain Blake looked unsure of himself. The storm was just beginning. David Robinson moved through the terminal like a man accustomed to being watched. Though the attention rarely came with admiration, he had the kind of presence that could part a room without a word. Broad shoulders beneath a tailored suit. A calm gaze that seemed to see through people. But today, his steps carried something heavier. A quiet anger tempered only by years of knowing what the wrong kind of reaction might cost him. Ava stood where he could see her, her posture unbroken, though he knew her well enough to notice the slight tension in her shoulders. Her elegance was both armor and invitation, daring those around her to underestimate her even as she refused to be diminished. The small crowd at gate 17 had grown, their murmurs soft and speculative. Most people avoided looking directly at Ava or the pilot who stood nearby. But their silence was its own kind of judgment. David's eyes swept the scene, taking it all in the way the gate agent fidgeted with the scanner. The way Captain Matthew Blake stood with his arms folded, his expression carefully neutral but his body radiating a smug authority. The air between them was thick with something unspoken yet unmistakable. The kind of tension David had encountered countless times before. As he approached, the murmurs grew quieter, the crowd's collective curiosity giving way to something closer to reverence. People could sense it, even if they didn't understand it. David Robinson was not a man to be trifled with. "David," Ava said, her voice steady but carrying an edge that only he would recognize. He reached her side in 2 strides, his hand brushing briefly against hers in a gesture of solidarity before turning his attention to Blake. The pilot met his gaze, and for a moment, neither man spoke. It was a silent battle, one that Blake seemed determined to win simply by refusing to back down. "Is there a problem here?" David asked, his voice calm but firm. Blake tilted his head slightly, as if trying to decide whether to engage. "Just ensuring protocol is followed," he said, his tone carefully measured. "We've had some incidents recently." David raised an eyebrow, the faintest flicker of disbelief crossing his face. "Protocol," he repeated, his voice heavy with skepticism. "And what exactly about my wife requires this level of scrutiny?" Blake shifted slightly, his confidence wavering but not yet broken. "As I said, it's standard procedure. Passenger safety is our priority." Ava, still standing tall, let out a soft breath, though her gaze never left Blake. "Interesting," she said, her tone sharp but controlled. "Because no one else in this line has been subjected to standard procedure." The gate agent, a young man who looked as though he wished he could vanish, opened his mouth to speak but quickly closed it again when David turned his attention to him. "Your name?" David asked, his voice polite but leaving no room for deflection. It's Brandon," the agent stammered, his cheeks reddening. "Brandon, sir." "Brandon," David said evenly. "Was there an issue with my wife's ticket?" Brandon hesitated, glancing nervously at Blake, who gave him the barest shake of his head, a silent warning. But David caught the exchange, his jaw tightening imperceptibly. He had seen this before. The way power was wielded in whispers and glances. The way complicity thrived in the spaces where silence reigned. "No, sir," Brandon finally admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. "There was no issue." Blake's smirk returned, though it was smaller now. more strained. "With all due respect, Mr. Robinson," he began, his tone bordering on patronizing. "As the captain of this flight, I have the authority to address any concerns I deem necessary." David took a step closer, his presence towering. "And what, exactly, was the concern?" he asked, his voice dropping lower, quieter, a tone that demanded honesty without raising its volume. Blake hesitated, his confidence faltering under the weight of the question. Around them, the crowd watched in rapt silence, the tension thick enough to cut. For a moment, it seemed as though Blake might double down, but the quiet intensity of David's gaze seemed to unnerve him. "Look," Blake said finally, his tone defensive, "I was just following protocol. Don't insult my intelligence," David said, his voice sharp but controlled. "This isn't about protocol. This is about prejudice. Plain and simple." Blake's face reddened, and he opened his mouth to respond. But before he could, David turned to Brandon. "Scan the ticket," he instructed, his tone brooking no argument. Brandon obeyed immediately, his hands trembling slightly as he completed the process. "It's valid," he said quickly, glancing up at David. "There's no problem here." David nodded, then turned back to Blake. "Then my wife will board the plane." Now, the crowd, which had remained silent throughout the exchange, began to murmur again, their whispers carrying a mixture of awe and discomfort. Some looked away, unwilling to confront what they had just witnessed. Others watched intently, their expressions a mix of curiosity and quiet admiration. Blake, his jaw tight, stepped aside, though the defiance in his posture remained. David ignored him, focusing instead on Ava, who met his gaze with a calm determination that mirrored his own. "Are you ready?" he asked her softly. "Yes," she replied, her voice steady. Together, they stepped past the gate and onto the boarding bridge, leaving the crowd behind. But as they walked, David's mind raced. This was not the first time he had faced this kind of challenge. And he knew it would not be the last. The weight of the moment pressed heavily on him, not because of what had happened but because of what it represented. This was not just about Ava or Captain Blake or the silent complicity of the passengers who had stood by and watched. It was about a system that allowed moments like this to happen over and over again. A system that demanded silence and submission from those it sought to marginalize. David knew better than to let his anger consume him. Anger was a fire, and if left unchecked, it could burn indiscriminately, but he also knew that some fires were necessary not to destroy, but to illuminate. As they reached the door of the plane, he resolved that this would not end here. Not for Ava, not for anyone. The storm had arrived, and it was far from over. The air inside the cabin was different, heavy with a tension that clung to every corner, every seat. Ava and David settled into their first-class seats, though the plush leather and extra legroom did little to ease the weight of what had just transpired. The hum of the engines preparing for takeoff was a dull roar beneath the murmurs of passengers who still stole glances in their direction. Ava adjusted her scarf, her movements deliberate, as if each small action could help her rebuild the composure that had been tested at the gate. David leaned back slightly, his eyes scanning the cabin, noting the flight attendants who avoided their gaze and the passengers who pretended not to notice them. The space felt smaller, more confined, as if the plane itself carried the weight of what had just unfolded. Ava could feel it too, the unspoken tension that comes when people witness injustice but say nothing. When silence becomes complicity. "David," Ava said softly, breaking the quiet between them. He turned to her, his brow furrowed. "Yes? You didn't have to come all the way to the gate," she said, though there was no rebuke in her tone. Only gratitude, mixed with a weariness she tried to hide. "I could have handled it." David's jaw tightened. "You shouldn't have had to handle it at all," he replied. His voice was low, steady, but there was an edge to it that Ava recognized, a frustration he rarely let surface but that simmered beneath the surface now, refusing to be contained. Before she could respond, a flight attendant approached, her hands clasped nervously in front of her. She was young, likely new, and the tension in her shoulders suggested she was aware of the scene that had played out at the gate. "Mr. and Mrs. Robinson," she began, her voice tinged with an uneasy politeness. "On behalf of the crew, I want to apologize for the misunderstanding earlier." Ava looked up at her, her expression unreadable. "Thank you," she said simply, her tone even. She didn't want to make the young woman more uncomfortable than she already was. But neither did she feel like letting her off the hook entirely. The apology felt like an offering made out of obligation rather than sincerity. A gesture meant to smooth things over without addressing the root of the problem. The attendant nodded quickly and retreated, leaving Ava and David alone again. David exhaled sharply, his frustration mounting. Misunderstanding, he muttered under his breath, shaking his head. That's what they always call it. Ava reached out, her hand resting gently on his arm. Let it go, David, she said softly, at least for now. But David couldn't let it go. Not yet. His mind churned with thoughts of all the times they had faced moments like this. Moments that were dismissed as misunderstandings or protocol or policy. He thought of the small indignities that added up to something much larger. Something that weighed on them every time they stepped into spaces that were not made for them. As the plane taxied to the runway, David's thoughts were interrupted by another voice, a man seated across the aisle. Older, with a weathered face that carried the kind of skepticism born of a long life. Excuse me, the man said, leaning slightly toward David. His tone was hesitant, but there was a curiosity in his eyes that he couldn't quite hide. I couldn't help but notice what happened back there. David turned to him, his expression carefully neutral. Is that so? The man nodded, his gaze flicking briefly to Ava before returning to David. I just wanted to say, I've been flying for decades, and I've never seen anything like that. Ava tilted her head slightly, her dark eyes narrowing. What exactly do you mean? She asked, her voice calm but carrying an edge that made the man hesitate. I mean, well, he faltered, clearly struggling to find the right words. It's just unusual, isn't it, for someone to stand up like that, to push back. David leaned forward slightly, his posture commanding without being overtly confrontational. Unusual for who? He asked. For us to stand up? Or for them to back down? The man's face flushed slightly, and he leaned back in his seat. I didn't mean anything by it, he said quickly, though the discomfort in his voice suggested otherwise. I just thought it was admirable. Ava exchanged a glance with David, her lips tightening into a faint, knowing smile. It was a familiar dance. This awkward attempt at reconciliation from someone who had likely benefited from the same systems that had just tried to humiliate her. She could see the man's unease, his attempt to distance himself from the tension while still trying to align himself with their righteousness. Admirable, Ava repeated, her tone thoughtful. It's funny how standing up for yourself is seen as admirable when it should just be expected. The man opened his mouth to respond but seemed to think better of it. He nodded instead, retreating into silence, though his discomfort lingered in the air like smoke after a fire. As the plane lifted into the sky, Ava closed her eyes briefly, letting the hum of the engines fill the space left by the man's aborted conversation. David watched her, his own frustration giving way to a quieter determination. This isn't over, he said softly, almost to himself. Ava opened her eyes, turning to him. It never is, she replied, and they both knew she was right. The fight wasn't just at the gate or in the cabin or with Captain Blake. It was in the fabric of the world they lived in, woven so tightly that even the people who thought themselves allies could barely see it. It was in the pauses, the hesitations, the well-meaning but misguided comments that reminded them, again and again, that the fight was far from won. But as they soared above the clouds, Ava and David made a silent promise to each other. They would keep fighting, not just for themselves but for the countless others who couldn't, or wouldn't, or didn't yet know how. The reckoning was coming, and this time, it wouldn't be ignored. The boardroom was a fortress of glass and steel, perched high above the city skyline like a castle detached from the world below. Ava Robinson sat at the head of the long table, her posture straight, her hands resting calmly on the smooth surface. She had been in rooms like this before, rooms where power operated in whispers and sideways glances, where decisions were made not to change the world but to keep it spinning comfortably for those already at the top. This time, though, she wasn't here as a guest or an observer. This time, she had the floor. The air was thick with tension as executives from the airline's leadership team filed in, their expressions ranging from polite curiosity to barely concealed skepticism. They knew why they were here. Word of the incident at the gate had spread quickly, and the pressure to respond had only grown louder. But change, real change, was a language most of them had never learned to speak. David Robinson was present too, seated at the opposite end of the table, his quiet authority filling the room like a second presence. He had insisted on being here, not because Ava needed his support, but because he wanted the executives to understand exactly how serious this was. This wasn't just about fixing a public relations problem. It was about dismantling a culture that had allowed such problems to exist in the first place. Thank you all for being here, Ava began, her voice steady and clear. I won't waste your time with pleasantries. We have a problem, and that problem is bigger than what happened at Gate 17. The room was silent, save for the soft hum of the air conditioning. Some of the executives shifted in their seats, their discomfort palpable. Others sat motionless, their expressions blank, as if trying to gauge just how far Ava intended to take this. This isn't just about one incident or one employee, Ava continued, her gaze sweeping across the table. It's about a system, a culture that allows incidents like this to happen over and over again without consequence. A man in his mid-50s, seated midway down the table, cleared his throat. His name was Richard Harris, and he wore the look of someone who believed he'd seen it all. With all due respect, Mrs. Robinson, he said, his tone measured but faintly dismissive. This feels like an overreaction. Gate agents make mistakes. It happens. I'm not sure it's fair to paint this as a systemic issue. Ava turned her gaze to him, her expression calm but unyielding. Mr. Harris, she said, if you don't believe this is a systemic issue, then you haven't been paying attention. And that, in itself, is part of the problem. David leaned forward slightly, his presence amplifying Ava's words. This isn't just about one gate agent, he said, his tone low but firm. It's about the message we send as a company when we allow these mistakes to go unchecked. Every time we dismiss these incidents as isolated, we're telling our employees and our customers that their experiences don't matter. Richard shifted uncomfortably but said nothing. Across the table, a younger woman named Julia spoke up, her voice hesitant but thoughtful. I understand the need to address this, she said, but where do we start? Changing a culture isn't easy. And it's not something we can do overnight. Ava nodded, acknowledging the point. You're right, she said, this isn't easy, and it won't happen overnight. But we have to start somewhere. That's why I'm proposing a comprehensive diversity and inclusion initiative, mandatory training for every employee. From gate agents to executives. We'll also implement an anonymous reporting system to ensure that employees and customers feel safe speaking up about discrimination without fear of retaliation. Another executive, an older man with silver hair and an air of quiet authority, leaned forward. And how do you plan to measure success? He asked. These kinds of initiatives often sound good on paper. But how do we know they'll actually make a difference? Ava met his gaze, her tone resolute. We measure success by the experiences of our employees and customers, she said, by the number of complaints we receive, by the feedback we get from those who've been marginalized, and by the culture we build moving forward. This isn't just about avoiding lawsuits or bad press, it's about doing what's right. The room fell silent again, the weight of her words settling over the table like a heavy blanket. David watched the executives carefully, noting the subtle shifts in their expressions. Some were resistant, clinging to the status quo. Others were curious, perhaps even cautiously supportive, but none of them could ignore the quiet force of Ava's presence. The way she commanded the room without raising her voice. If anyone here doesn't believe in this mission, Ava said finally, her voice cutting through the silence like a blade, then you're free to leave. But understand this. Inaction is no longer an option. Not for this company. And not for this industry. No one moved. No one spoke. And in that moment, Ava knew she had their attention, not their full support. Perhaps, but their attention. It was a start. After the meeting, David found Ava in her temporary office, reviewing the notes she had taken during the discussion. She looked up as he entered, her expression a mix of determination and weariness. You handled that well, he said, leaning against the doorframe. Even Harris didn't know how to respond. Ava sighed, setting her notes aside. It's exhausting, she admitted, convincing people that equality isn't just a nice idea but a necessity. David walked over, placing a hand on her shoulder. You're not just convincing them, he said, you're changing minds. That's harder, but it's also more impactful. Ava smiled faintly, her resolve rekindling. Then I guess I'll keep pushing, she said, no matter how long it takes. And as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting the city in shades of gold and amber, Ava knew that the road ahead would be long and fraught with resistance. But she also knew that the fight was worth it, not just for herself, but for everyone who would come after her. The battle for change was far from over, but it had begun. The sun rose reluctantly the next morning, casting long shadows over the glass facade of the airline's headquarters. Ava Robinson stood in her office, coffee in hand, watching the city come alive below her. The meeting from the day before lingered in her mind, its echoes as persistent as the rhythm of her heart. It had been a small victory, but she knew better than to celebrate too soon. Systems, she thought, are like ancient machines, resistant to change and quick to crush those who dared to disrupt them. Her phone buzzed on the desk, breaking her reverie. The number was unfamiliar. She hesitated for a moment before answering. "This is Ava Robinson." A young assistant's voice crackled through the line, tight with urgency. "Mrs. Robinson, there's an incident at Gate 27. Security flagged it on the cameras." Ava set her coffee down, her body tense. "What happened?" "It's a passenger," the assistant said, her words coming quickly. "A black man in business attire. He's being stopped by the gate agent. It looks like the same thing as before." Ava's grip tightened on the phone. "I'll be there in 5 minutes," she said, grabbing her blazer. "Tell security to meet me at the gate." The scene at Gate 27 felt like déjà vu, though the players had changed. A black man, tall and composed in a sharp gray suit, stood at the counter, his frustration barely concealed. The gate agent, a woman in her late 20s, was gesturing toward his ticket with exaggerated concern. Around them, a small crowd of passengers had gathered, their murmurs an indistinct hum of curiosity and discomfort. Ava moved through the crowd with purpose, her heels clicking against the polished floor. She caught snippets of conversation as she passed. "Why are they holding him up? Do you think it's his ticket? Looks like trouble." The words were like static, distracting but ultimately meaningless. She had heard them all before. The gate agent noticed Ava approaching and froze, her face flushing with recognition. "Mrs. Robinson," she stammered. "I didn't realize you were here." Ava's gaze didn't waver. "What's going on here?" she asked, her tone calm but firm. The passenger turned to Ava, his expression a mixture of relief and frustration. "They're saying my ticket needs verification," he said, his voice measured. "I've provided my ID and confirmation number twice already." Ava looked back at the gate agent. "Is that true?" The woman hesitated, her eyes darting between Ava and the passenger. It's just that the ticket seemed unusual," she said weakly. "We've been trained to watch for anything suspicious." Ava raised an eyebrow. "Suspicious? And what exactly about this man's ticket or his appearance seems suspicious to you?" The agent opened her mouth to respond but faltered, her silence speaking louder than any excuse could have. The passenger crossed his arms, his frustration now evident. "I've flown with this airline for years," he said, his voice sharp, "and this is the first time I've been treated like this." "Why?" Ava turned back to him, her expression softening. "Mr. Carter," he supplied. "Anthony Carter." "Mr. Carter," Ava said, her voice steady. "I want to personally apologize for this experience. It's unacceptable, and it doesn't reflect the values we're working to uphold." Before Carter could respond, the gate agent interjected, her voice trembling. "I didn't mean any harm," she said, desperation creeping into her tone. "I was just trying to follow protocol." "Harm was done," Ava said sharply, her gaze piercing. "Mr. Carter was humiliated in front of his peers because of your assumptions. That's exactly what we're trying to eliminate." She gestured for a nearby supervisor to step forward. "Escort Mr. Carter to first class," she instructed. "Ensure he's comfortable and compensated for his time." The supervisor nodded and guided Carter toward the boarding tunnel, murmuring quiet reassurances. Ava watched them go before turning back to the gate agent, who now looked close to tears. "What's your name?" Ava asked. "Claire," the woman said softly. "Claire," Ava said, her tone firm but measured. "I understand that unconscious bias can influence decisions. That's why we've implemented training and new policies to prevent situations like this." Claire nodded quickly, her hands clasped tightly in front of her. "I've attended the sessions, Mrs. Robinson. I thought I was doing the right thing." Ava sighed, her expression softening slightly. "Mistakes happen, Claire, but accountability is key. This incident will be reviewed with and you'll be required to attend additional training. For now, you're suspended pending investigation." Tears welled in Claire's eyes. But she nodded. I understand, she whispered. Later that evening, Ava sat in the quiet of her living room, the glow of the fireplace casting warm light across the space. She recounted the day's events to David, her voice calm but tinged with weariness. You handled it perfectly, David said, his tone reassuring. This is exactly why you're leading this effort. Ava leaned back against the cushions, her thoughts distant. It's progress, she said softly, but it's also a reminder of how far we still have to go. People like Claire don't act out of malice, they act out of ignorance. And ignorance is harder to fight. David reached over, taking her hand in his. You're fighting it every day, he said, and every day, you're making a difference. Ava smiled faintly, her resolve rekindled. I just hope it's enough. It will be, David said with certainty, because you won't stop until it is. As the night deepened, Ava's thoughts returned to Anthony Carter, his calm dignity, his quiet frustration, and the strength he showed in the face of adversity. He reminded her of why this fight mattered. It wasn't just about fixing policies or changing procedures. It was about creating a world where no one had to prove their worth. Where dignity wasn't something to be earned but something inherent, something unquestionable. The system had been tested, and the cracks were beginning to show. But Ava knew that the real fight was only just beginning. The morning was unforgiving, the sky an unbroken sheet of gray. Ava Robinson sat at the head of a packed press room, cameras clicking like distant gunfire. The airline's logo loomed behind her, polished and corporate, but the moment was anything but smooth. She could feel the weight of the eyes on her, not just the journalists in the room, but the countless viewers across the country who would read her every word, every gesture, as a measure of her strength, her humanity, or her fault. The press conference had been called in the wake of the latest incident. News of Anthony Carter's experience at Gate 27 had spread, sparking outrage that rippled through social media and spilled into mainstream outlets. It wasn't just a story, it was a flashpoint, one that ignited deep-seated frustrations about race, power, and belonging in America. For many, it was another reminder of how the rules of engagement were different depending on who you were, where you came from, and how the world saw you. Ava adjusted the microphone in front of her, her expression calm but resolute. She was no stranger to these moments, where words had to carry not just meaning but intention, where each sentence could either ignite hope or fuel outrage. She took a breath and began. Good morning, she said, her voice clear. Thank you for being here. I want to start by addressing the incident involving Mr. Anthony Carter, one of our valued passengers. What happened to him at Gate 27 was unacceptable. It was not just a failure of protocol but a failure of principle. And for that, I take full responsibility. The room buzzed with murmurs, the sharp tap of keyboards filling the silence. Ava continued, her gaze steady as she met the eyes of the reporters in front of her. This is not an isolated incident, she said, her voice firm. It is part of a larger problem, one that extends beyond our airline and into the very fabric of our society. Discrimination, whether overt or subtle, has no place here, and yet, it persists. We see it in our policies, our assumptions, our actions. That must change. A hand shot up from the middle of the room. It belonged to a man in his 60s, his salt and pepper hair neatly combed, his pen poised over a notepad. Mrs. Robinson, he began, his voice measured. Critics have argued that incidents like this reflect individual mistakes rather than systemic issues. What makes you confident this is a systemic problem? Ava's lips tightened slightly, her patience worn thin by such questions. Systemic problems, she said, aren't always visible to those who benefit from the system. It's easy to dismiss discrimination as an anomaly when it doesn't affect you. But for people like Mr. Carter and myself, it is not an anomaly. It is a reality we navigate every day. Her words landed heavily, silencing the room. Another journalist spoke up, this time a younger woman. What specific actions are you taking to ensure accountability within your airline? Ava nodded, welcoming the question. We've implemented mandatory diversity and inclusion training for all employees, from gate agents to executives. We've also launched an anonymous reporting system to ensure employees and customers feel safe addressing discrimination. And we are actively reviewing our policies to identify and eliminate biases. Before she could continue, another reporter interrupted. And Captain Blake, the pilot involved in the original incident at Gate 17? What's happening with him? Ava's expression hardened for a moment, but she quickly regained her composure. Captain Matthew Blake is no longer employed by this airline. His actions not only humiliated my family but also jeopardized the integrity of this company. We will not tolerate behavior that undermines our values. The room erupted in whispers, the weight of her words rippling outward like a stone dropped into water. But Ava wasn't finished. She leaned forward slightly, her voice softening but losing none of its resolve. This isn't just about fixing our airline, she said. It's about setting a standard. If we're serious about combating discrimination, we have to look beyond our own walls and confront the deeper, more uncomfortable truths about who we are and what we've allowed to persist. The press conference wasn't the end of it. Of course, the days that followed were a whirlwind of headlines, public reactions, and internal meetings. For every message of support, there were twice as many accusations, criticisms, and doubts. David found Ava in her office late one evening, her desk cluttered with papers and her face drawn with exhaustion. He placed a hand on her shoulder, his touch grounding her in a way nothing else could. "You did well today," he said simply. Ava sighed, rubbing her temples. "Did I? The media's already twisting my words. The employees are divided, and the board is breathing down my neck. It feels like I'm fighting 100 battles at once." David crouched beside her, meeting her gaze. "That's because you are," he said gently, "but you're winning the ones that matter. People are listening, Ava, maybe not all of them, but enough." She nodded slowly, his words a small but needed comfort. "It's just exhausting," she admitted, "trying to change something that doesn't want to be changed." David smiled faintly. "Change is never easy, but you're not doing this alone." Ava reached for his hand, her fingers curling around his. "I know," she said softly, "but sometimes it feels like the weight of the world is on my shoulders." "It is," David said, his voice steady, "but you're strong enough to carry it." The real test came a week later, when the airline's diversity and inclusion initiative faced its first major backlash. A group of senior pilots, mostly older, mostly white, filed a complaint, arguing that the new policies were unfairly targeting them and creating a hostile work environment. The board called an emergency meeting, and Ava stood once again at the head of the table, facing a room of skeptical faces. The air was thick with tension. The unspoken divide between progress and resistance laid bare. Ava didn't flinch. She addressed the complaints head-on, dismantling their arguments with facts, statistics, and an unshakable resolve. "This isn't about targeting anyone," she said, her voice cutting through the tension like a blade. "It's about creating a workplace where everyone, regardless of their background, feels respected and valued. If that feels threatening to some of you, then perhaps the problem isn't the policies. Perhaps it's the culture you've grown accustomed to." The room fell silent. Even those who had opposed her seemed to recognize the truth in her words. Change, Ava knew, was a battle fought inch by inch, and she was determined to win every one. As the meeting adjourned, David caught her eye from across the room. His expression was one of quiet pride, a silent reminder that she wasn't in this fight alone. And as Ava left the boardroom, the weight on her shoulders felt a little lighter. She knew the road ahead would be long and fraught with challenges. But she also knew she was ready for whatever came next. The system had tested her resolve, and she had answered with fire. The fight wasn't over, but the momentum was hers. And she wouldn't stop until the world was better, not just for herself, but for everyone who deserved a chance to live without the burden of prejudice. The courthouse loomed large, its facade a blend of stone and shadow under the weight of an overcast sky. It was an old building, its architecture grand but cold, a monument to justice that too often faltered under the weight of its own contradictions. Ava Robinson stood at the entrance, her posture regal despite the tension that coiled in her chest. Beside her, David placed a steadying hand on her back, his touch a quiet reassurance. Inside, the trial of Captain Matthew Blake had drawn a crowd, a mix of reporters, advocates, and curious onlookers. The courtroom buzzed with muted conversation, the air electric with anticipation. For some, this was a spectacle; for others, it was a moment of reckoning. Ava knew it was both. Blake, seated with his legal team, wore an expression that hovered between indignation and unease. He had filed a wrongful termination lawsuit against the airline, claiming he was unfairly targeted in the wake of the Gate 17 incident. But as more details emerged, patterns of complaints, Whispers of similar behavior toward other passengers. His case had become a lightning rod for discussions about race, accountability, and the limits of power. Ava and David took their seats, their presence commanding attention without a word. This wasn't just about Blake. It was about the culture that had shielded him, the unspoken rules that allowed discrimination to flourish under the guise of protocol. And it was about whether that culture could finally be dismantled. The trial unfolded with the slow, deliberate rhythm of a chess game. Blake's attorney painted him as a model employee, a victim of corporate overreach. They argued that his actions at Gate 17 were taken in good faith, that he had been unfairly scapegoated in the airline's rush to address public backlash. But Ava's legal team countered with precision, presenting evidence that went beyond the single incident. Testimonies from passengers and employees painted a damning picture of a man who wielded his authority carelessly, whose judgments were shaped more by bias than by any genuine concern for safety. When Ava was called to the stand, the courtroom hushed. She stepped forward with a quiet grace, her resolve visible in every step. Taking her seat, she met the attorney's gaze, her expression calm but unyielding. "Mrs. Robinson," the attorney began, his tone measured but probing. "As the architect of the airline's diversity and inclusion initiative, would you say you had a personal interest in ensuring Captain Blake was terminated?" Ava tilted her head slightly, considering the question. "I have a personal interest in ensuring that every passenger and employee is treated with dignity and respect," she replied. "Captain Blake's termination was not about me. It was about upholding those values." The attorney pressed on. "But would you agree that the incident at Gate 17, involving you and your husband, influenced your judgment?" Ava didn't flinch. "It opened my eyes," she said, "but it didn't cloud my judgment. Captain Blake's actions were part of a larger pattern, one that couldn't be ignored." The attorney leaned forward, his expression sharpening. "And yet, there are those who believe this was a calculated move away for the airline to salvage its public image. What do you say to that?" Ava's gaze didn't waver. "I say that the truth speaks for itself," she said. "The question isn't why Captain Blake was terminated. The question is why it took so long for his behavior to be addressed." Her words hung in the air, heavy with implication. The attorney hesitated, sensing the shift in the room. Ava's calm defiance had turned the line of questioning against him, reframing the narrative with an unassailable clarity. The final day of the trial was a crescendo of arguments, each side fighting to tip the scales. But when the judge delivered the verdict, it was swift and unequivocal. The court ruled in favor of the airline, dismissing Blake's claims as baseless. A murmur rippled through the courtroom, a mix of relief and muted applause. Blake's face flushed with anger, his bravado crumbling under the weight of the decision. He muttered something to his attorney, but the words were lost in the noise. Ava and David remained seated, their expressions composed but their eyes meeting in a silent exchange of triumph. It wasn't a victory they celebrated, but a step forward in a fight that was far from over. Later that evening, Ava and David sat together in their living room, the glow of the fireplace softening the sharp edges of the day. They had opened a bottle of wine, though neither had touched it yet. Instead, they sat in quiet reflection, the weight of the trial still settling over them. "You were brilliant," David said finally, his voice breaking the silence. Ava smiled faintly, though her expression remained thoughtful. "It's strange," she said. "I thought winning would feel more decisive. But all I can think about is how much work there's still left to do." David nodded, his gaze steady. "This was never going to be the end," he said, "but it's a start, and a powerful one." Ava leaned back, her eyes drifting to the window. Outside, the city lights flickered like distant stars, each one a reminder of the countless lives her work sought to touch. "Do you ever wonder," she said softly, "if the people who resist change so fiercely know, deep down, that it's inevitable?" David considered her words, then smiled. "Maybe, or maybe they just fear what they don't understand." Ava nodded, her resolve rekindling. "Then we'll make them understand," she said, "one step at a time." As the night deepened, Ava allowed herself a rare moment of peace. The road ahead would be long, and the challenges would only grow more complex. But for the first time in a long time, she felt the stirrings of hope not just for herself, but for the world she was helping to build. The trial was over, but the fight was not, and Ava Robinson was ready for whatever came next. The ballroom was a sea of faces: executives, activists, journalists, and young professionals gathered under the glow of chandeliers that cast the room in warm, golden light. Ava Robinson stood just behind the curtain, her heart steady but her mind racing. Outside, the audience buzzed with anticipation. The keynote speaker, the woman whose name had become synonymous with change in the airline industry, was about to take the stage. She took a deep breath. This wasn't her first time speaking to a crowd. But tonight felt different. The weight of the past year, its victories and its bruises pressed against her shoulders. Yet there was something else, too. A quiet, insistent pride. She had carried the burden of a fight most would rather avoid. And while the scars it left were still tender, she knew they were worth it. The applause began even before she stepped into view, swelling like a wave that crashed as she appeared under the spotlight. Ava moved to the podium, her expression calm but resolute, the kind of composure born from a lifetime of navigating a world that too often questioned her place in it. "Good evening," she began, her voice carrying across the room with quiet authority. "Tonight, I want to talk about turbulence." There was a ripple of quiet laughter. But Ava didn't smile. "Not the kind you encounter at 30,000 feet." She continued, "but the kind that exists in the spaces we inhabit every day. The turbulence of assumptions, of biases, of systems that tell some of us to sit quietly while others get to steer the course." The room stilled, her words landing heavily. She let the silence linger for a moment before continuing. "This past year has been a lesson in turbulence," she said. "I've seen it in boardrooms, in airport terminals, in the faces of people who look like me and have been told, in ways large and small, that they don't belong. And I've seen it in the resistance to change, sometimes quiet, sometimes loud, but always there." Her gaze swept across the audience, her expression softening slightly. "But I've also seen something else. I've seen courage. I've seen resilience. I've seen what happens when people refuse to accept the status quo. When they demand more, not just for themselves, but for those who come after them." The weeks following the trial had been a whirlwind of both progress and resistance. The airline's diversity and inclusion initiative had gained traction, earning praise from advocates and scrutiny from skeptics. Policies were being rewritten, training programs expanded, and the anonymous reporting system had become a model for other companies looking to address their own blind spots. But for every step forward, there was pushback. Employees grumbled about the burden of new training sessions. Some passengers boycotted the airline, claiming its focus on equity was divisive. And while the court's ruling against Captain Blake had been a victory, it had also sparked debates that raged across news outlets and social media. Through it all, Ava pressed forward, her determination unshaken. She knew that change was rarely linear, that progress often came in fits and starts. But she also knew that the seeds she was planting would grow, even if it took longer than she hoped. "Mrs. Robinson?" The voice brought her back to the present. A young woman stood at her side, holding a microphone. Her eyes were bright, her smile wide, and her presence exuded the kind of energy that reminded Ava of herself. "Years ago." "May I ask you a question?" the woman said, her voice trembling slightly with nerves. Ava nodded, stepping aside from the podium to give her the space to speak. The young woman turned to the crowd, her voice growing stronger as she addressed them. "I'm a first-year employee at this airline," she said, "and I just want to say thank you. Thank you for making this a place where I feel like I can be myself, where I don't have to hide who I am to fit in. My question is, how do you keep going? When the resistance feels so overwhelming, how do you stay hopeful?" The room fell silent, all eyes on Ava. She considered the question for a moment, her mind flickering to the moments that had tested her resolve: the stairs at Gate 17, the grueling boardroom debates, the courtroom where she had fought not just for herself but for an idea of what the world could be. "I stay hopeful," she said finally, "because of people like you." The young woman's eyes widened slightly, her surprise genuine. "I stay hopeful," Ava continued, her voice steady, "because every time we push through resistance, we make room for someone else to step into their power. Change doesn't happen because one person demands it. It happens because that demand becomes a movement, carried by people who refuse to let the world remain as it is." She stepped closer to the microphone, her gaze sweeping across the room. "And it happens because we understand that resistance is not the enemy. Fear is. Fear of losing power. fear of sharing space, fear of confronting truths that are hard to face. But courage is contagious. And every act of courage, no matter how small, chips away at the walls that divide us. The audience erupted into applause. A standing ovation that filled the room like a tidal wave. Ava stepped back, her expression calm but her heart swelling with a quiet pride. This wasn't just her victory. It belonged to everyone who had dared to stand up, to speak out, to demand more. Later that night, Ava and David sat on their balcony, the city sprawling beneath them in a mosaic of lights. The air was crisp, the kind that hinted at the change of seasons. David poured them each a glass of wine, his movements unhurried. "You were remarkable tonight," he said, handing her a glass. Ava smiled, the warmth of his words settling over her. "I just spoke the truth," she said simply. David raised his glass. "To the truth," he said, "and to the woman brave enough to tell it." They clinked glasses, the sounds soft but resonant. Ava leaned back, her gaze drifting to the stars. The fight wasn't over, it never truly was. But tonight, she allowed herself to rest, knowing that the seeds of change were taking root. In the quiet of the night, Ava Robinson felt something she hadn't felt in a long time: peace. And she knew, with unwavering certainty, that the legacy she was building would endure.